You hear the same message over and over and over again from different entities, like Weight Watchers, for example. Weight Watchers has a lot of 0-point foods, like fruits and vegetables. However, some of those 0-point foods spike your blood sugar and they spike your insulin and they contribute to fat storage. So if you're only following somebody else's rules on a diet and you're not learning for yourself, how does food impact my blood sugar, which in turn impacts my insulin, you will never figure this out. And this is the biggest dietary mistake that I see people make, is under eating. Calories are just a man-made unit to measure energy in a food. Your body doesn't necessarily recognize calories, it recognizes energy. And in order to use those calories, we need hormones. Everything in our body is automatically controlled by hormones. How fast your hair grows, how fast your nails grow, how fast you breathe, how fast your heart beats. All of that is automatically controlled, as is your body weight and how much body fat you store. So there are things that we can do to influence our hormones, namely insulin. And that's the one I really like getting into, because that's your fat creation and storage hormone. And so many people have grown up with the belief, as I did too, that if you want to lose weight, it's all about eating less and exercising more. And the problem with that model is that it doesn't emphasize quality of food. You can eat less Twinkies, you can eat less whatever you're currently eating, cheeseburgers and fast food, and lose weight. And when you think about that, it does not set you up for long-term health. There's a few foundational things that we have to focus on when it comes to long-term health. And this requires switching your mindset from the goal is not losing weight. We don't care about that. What we care about is long-term sustainable body recomposition, losing fat mass, gaining lean muscle mass in a way that is healthy for us physically, mentally, and emotionally. That requires a completely different strategy and mindset than simply eating less and exercising more. Another thing that I like to, it's the illusion of truth is what I call it. You hear the same message over and over and over again from different entities, like Weight Watchers, for example. Weight Watchers has a lot of 0-point foods, like fruits and vegetables. However, some of those 0-point foods spike your blood sugar and they spike your insulin and they contribute to fat storage. So if you're only following somebody else's rules on a diet and you're not learning for yourself, how does food impact my blood sugar, which in turn impacts my insulin, you will never figure this out. And so I always encourage people, be a good student of your own body. When we're talking about insulin, I think let's get to the baseline of what is insulin. Insulin is a hormone made by your pancreas, and it is released when your blood sugars go up. And your blood sugars go up, especially after you have a high carbohydrate meal with refined carbohydrates like pasta or rice or a bunch of fruit. So when we're thinking about insulin, it's important to recognize there are 3 different kinds of macronutrients. There's carbohydrates, like I just mentioned, there's proteins, and there's dietary fats. So from the caloric model of obesity, they say eat a low-fat diet because fats have the most calories. There's 9 calories per gram of fat compared to 4 for protein and carbohydrates. But from the insulin model, that's not necessarily true. So from the insulin model of obesity, carbohydrates, especially refined starches and sugars, have the highest insulin response. They spike your blood sugar, so your insulin has to be released to push the blood sugar back down to baseline. Fiber is another type of carbohydrate that has a reverse response, essentially. It slows the digestion and absorption of other nutrients, so fiber is just fine. Protein has a moderate insulin response, worth the trade-off because you need protein for healthy muscles. Dietary fat has the lowest insulin response. So when we're looking at things from the insulin model, the question is always, how does this choice impact my insulin and my inflammation? And then when we're looking at it from the calorie model, it's how many calories is in this food? Is it a low-fat food? The other really nice thing about the insulin approach to obesity is you have more levers to pull. From the caloric model, it's eat less, move more. So it's very much diet and exercise focused. From the insulin model, it gets to the root cause of your hormonal issues, because many people have elevated insulin levels not from eating too much or from eating too many carbohydrates, but from sleep deprivation or chronic stress. because both of those things will raise a hormone called cortisol, which is your stress hormone. When cortisol is up, your blood sugars go up because your muscles think that you're stressed and you're going to need to fight or flee a situation. So your body naturally raises blood sugar for more available energy for those muscles to soak in and use. But if your stress is a work email or a fight with your partner or conflict with your child, that blood sugar is just hanging out in the bloodstream. It's not being absorbed by the muscles and used. So what happens then is insulin is released, and that pushes the insulin up even more. And I tell people, I know that it's so much easier just to cut carbs than it is to have honest conversations with your boss about your boundaries or shut Netflix off and go to bed on time. But those are going to be the needle movers. And that's what I mean when I say we have to study our own behavior more. I was going to say as much, but really it's more than what we study. A lot of people consume content. A lot of people read books. A lot of people take online courses. When was the last time you sat down and studied your own behavior? That is really how we start to change it.
It sounds like a much, much more comprehensive approach, a holistic approach even. You mentioned insulin there. What is insulin resistance then in that context? Because this is a term which we hear an awful lot about today.
Yeah, insulin resistance is essentially resistance to the hormone insulin. And what that means is your body gets resistant to the effects of insulin so that it requires more and more to get the job done. And a beautiful example of this is type 2 diabetes. With type 2 diabetes, your insulin resistance is rising for up to 2 decades before you actually see rises in your blood sugar and A1C level. Right now, at least in the US, physicians are not regularly checking insulin levels. However, research has shown that you can see a rise in your insulin because it needs more and more to get the job done, right? For up to 20 years before you would ever be flagged as pre-diabetic or diabetic from an A1C or a glucose reading. And that's one of my passions to get out there is we can do so much more to prevent diabetes if we are addressing insulin levels and insulin resistance earlier than if we are waiting for the downstream effect of elevated A1C and blood glucose levels.
And so then what's the relationship between elevated insulin and systemic inflammation?
They go hand in hand. So it's almost like this negative spiral. The more inflammation you have, the more insulin resistance you can develop. And insulin resistance in and of itself can drive inflammation. So insulin in high levels is inflammatory. That's why it's just this negative cycle that drives each other. And that's why we advocate a low insulin and inflammation lifestyle. Because if you're only focusing on insulin, you might be missing some really important pieces of the picture, like refined seed oils. Refined seed oils like canola oil, soybean oil, those are a dietary fat. They're a pure fat. They're not going to spike your blood sugar. They're not going to raise your insulin, but they will contribute to cellular inflammation. And over time, inflammation will drive insulin resistance. That's another reason we see a lot of people who take certain medications for an autoimmune condition like rheumatoid arthritis. It's a very inflammatory condition. They will also struggle with insulin resistance because of that baseline inflammation that they have in their body.
So should we be eating then in order to keep our insulin levels low exclusively?
And muscle mass. So we have to think about the big picture. Because if you only wanted to eat to keep insulin low, you could follow a pretty ketogenic lifestyle and think that you were setting yourself up for long-term success. Oh, my insulin is low, that's great. But what about long-term? That's where muscle mass comes into the picture. After you eat a meal, at least 80% of the carbohydrates are going to be deposited in your muscles. Your muscle is the reservoir for any glucose that we eat. And so I like to equate it to a garage. If you have a little bit of muscle mass, you can fit one car in your garage, not very much glucose. If you have a lot of muscle mass, you can fit more cars in your garage before the overflow goes in your driveway or on the street. That's similar to where you can eat more carbohydrates. They're going to be stored in your muscle as glycogen before the spillover goes to your fat tissue. So that is one reason that muscle mass is important, is simply glucose regulation before it's stored as fat. That's going to help us because excess fat is inflammatory. When we're thinking about nutrition, how do we want to eat? That's what I want people to think about is number one, how will this affect my insulin? Number two, am I getting the right stimulus to build and maintain muscle mass? And what that means is 1 gram of high quality protein per pound of ideal body weight a day. So for me, that's about 135 to 140 grams of protein a day. I'm 5'8". And even if ideal seems unrealistic to you, that doesn't matter for this specific number. From a muscle mass standpoint, you need an adequate dose of leucine, which is an essential amino acid found in higher amounts in high quality protein. And there's something called an anabolic trigger. And that's you have to have enough leucine in a meal to trigger new muscle protein synthesis, which means maintaining and building muscle mass. And this is the biggest dietary mistake that I see people make, is under eating protein per meal and per day. So 3 grams of leucine, that essential amino acid, is found in about 30 grams of high quality protein, meaning animal-based protein, eggs, meat, dairy, those types of foods, whey protein. If you are a vegan or a vegetarian, what I would suggest is a branched chain amino acid with supplement with each meal, because plant-based proteins are naturally lower in leucine. So you're going to want to be mindful of boosting that leucine content per meal. So 30 to 50 grams of protein per meal is my general recommendation. And then following that, I typically recommend, what is your personal carbohydrate threshold? So wearing a continuous glucose monitor can be really helpful to understand, what is my personal carbohydrate threshold? Mine is about 30 grams of net carbs per meal. I can eat that amount of net carbs and stay under about 110 milligrams per deciliter for my blood glucose. Levels Health is a continuous glucose monitoring company doing really good work on what are optimal levels of blood sugar management. And 110 is what they say, your blood sugar really should not go much higher than 110. And it shouldn't rise more than 30 milligrams per deciliter after any given meal. So that's what I mean when I say, what's your personal carbohydrate threshold? So many people are way overeating carbohydrates, and it's spiking their blood sugar, spiking the insulin. And if that happens over and over again, they're going to develop insulin resistance. So when we're thinking about how do I structure a meal properly, it's number one, 30 to 50 grams of protein. Number two, ideally about 10 grams of fiber. I have an ultimate food guide. You can link that up. It has so many different foods, fiber tables. I mean, if people want the food ideas, it's in there. It's free. The third is healthy fats. So again, in that ultimate food guide, it breaks down the different kinds of fats. They can look at that. But then keeping those starches and sugars low. So your net carbohydrates are going to include the starches and the sugars, not the fiber. And that's how I recommend structuring a meal, plus plenty of water. And when you eat like that, when you eat high protein, high fiber, some healthy fats, lower carbohydrate, not necessarily no carbohydrate, you will see amazing results. You're going to have such improved satiety between meals, so you don't feel like snacking all the time, because that's not good for your blood sugar and insulin levels. You're going to have better ability to grow and maintain lean muscle mass. And that is so important as we age. I'm a geriatric physical therapist by trade. And so I saw so many falls, a lot of sarcopenia or muscle wasting, a lot of fractures. And I'm very passionate about helping people improve their quality of life earlier in life and maintain that so that they don't need a geriatric physical therapist and months in rehab after a fall.
If you enjoyed that video, I know you'll get some value from this video right here.